Hello and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today we're going to be talking about Linux Rescue Mode. All right, so before we get started, what is Linux Rescue Mode? It is a couple of different things, and we'll show how you can enter it using the options in Red Hat Enterprise Linux. The first is that on every Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 and 9 system, there's another additional kernel installed called a rescue kernel. And so we'll start with that. That's useful for if you have kernel or initial RAM disk image problems, being able to boot your system in the face of those difficulties. In the initial RAM disk, there are some additional utilities included as well. So if you can boot into the kernel, there's some additional utilities that you can use for interacting with your machine. But more traditionally, Rescue is provided by the Red Hat Enterprise Linux install media. So we'll be showing an example of that as well. And that's for when we load a all in memory operating system onto your system. And then included in that is a whole bunch of troubleshooting utilities and applications that you might find handy for either trying to repair an unbootable system or trying to get access to data that unfortunately you can't get access to anymore because you don't have a working system. So that's what we're looking for rescue. It is not, it's probably like one of your last ditch efforts for fixing a system. And I will tell you from experience, if you watched any of the troubleshooting episodes that we did earlier, it is extremely hard to make a machine and break it in such a way that can be easily recovered. Right. So usually we're looking at rescue when we are past that. Right. The machine isn't easily recovered. I can't repair it. I'm looking to just get my data or get something off of it. All right. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So what we're looking at here is a virtual machine that I have running, and it's installed with RHEL 9 kernel and a RHEL 9.1 kernel. And so if I just selected the default, I would get booted up in a normal way. But you could see that there's also this rescue kernel here. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and boot it. Now this machine is operating perfectly fine. And so what's going to happen is it will boot up to kind of a more normal experience that we'd expect. This machine was installed with server with GUI, as much as Eric dislikes it. So it'll boot up and we're seeing it like launch the graphical boot progress. So that's why we have a little spinny wheel there. And then it's going to log me in or allow me to log in as a user to a graphical desktop. Oh, or maybe not. It's always good when your very first demo blows up on you. All right, looks like my trying it out earlier has caused me to actually need to use the other type of rescue, perhaps. Let's see. Oh no, it's doing a relabeling. So I did boot this machine into rescue mode earlier, and after you do that, you need to relabel your SELinux context on your file system, and so that's what's running here automatically is this relabeling. So yay for the second time having different behaviors. All right, but what should happen is it'll boot up and everything will be fine. Because when we choose rescue off of the boot menu of a running machine, what we're really doing is saying we want a different kernel and a different RAM disk to go with it. And once we get it up to a point where I can log into it, I'll show you where that's stored. All right, while we're waiting, let me go to my other machine. The other machine is going to be more horribly broken. All right, so this is my other machine. So it was running, everything was fine, it's freshly installed. And then I used this dd command. All right, so what I did with this dd command is I took null characters and overwrote the entirety of the dev SDA1 device. So here, I've essentially destroyed all the data that was stored on the /boot file system because I overrode it with null characters. So let me see if I reboot the machine. How terrible things are. Things are pretty terrible. Even the rebooting is terrible. So this is an example of how I've destroyed a machine in a way that it is not easily recoverable. And we're not going to try to recover it because instead, what we're going to do is we're going to attach the installation media to it, and we're going to boot it into rescue mode so that I can salvage the data that's left on the other unaffected file systems. All right, so let me change this to show a different window. All right, so I'm using VirtualBox as my virtualization technology. And so here's my machines. This RHEL 9 disk, that's the one I just rebooted and is having problems. So that one, I'm going to attach the Red Hat installer media to it. And first I'm going to power it off because it may not shut down well. And then I'm going to go into settings. One more time. Okay, I'm going to go into settings and under storage, I'm going to attach my secondary network thing. All right, let's try that one more time. So I went into settings for the machine, went to system. Sorry, let's try that again. Went to storage, and then I selected that I wanted my RHEL install media as a thing assigned to it. The other thing I'm going to double check is I'm going to go over to the system, and I'm going to make sure that the optical drive is looked at by the boot order before the hard disk. So as the machine boots up, it's going to check the floppy drive, see there's nothing there, see the optical drive, which I have loaded the Red Hat installer media on, and it's going to prefer to boot off of that instead of my known broken hard disk. All right, so issue. I'm going to go ahead and play it. All right, so here I am on the installation media, and I'm going to use the arrow keys to move down to the troubleshooting option. I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to offer me some options for utilities or ways that I can boot off of the install media for troubleshooting. And I'm interested in Rescue, a Red Hat Enterprise Linux system. All right, and it's going to boot up the rescue kernel. It's going to load an initial RAM disk into memory that has all kinds of utilities that I might find helpful. And then it's going to ask me a couple of questions. So this is some of the dialogue that you're seeing from the installer kernel, because that's the basis for our from ISO rescue mode. All right, so here's the first question. Rescue environment is going to try and mount my disk file system. And when it does so, it's going to put it under another mount point called MNT sysroot. And so it's asking me if it should try to mount that file system. That's what the continue option means. If it should try to mount the file systems, but assemble them in read-only mode, or I shouldn't even bother trying to mount file systems. I should just give me a root shell. And as root, I will try to access the machine with the utilities included in the rescue mode. So I'm going to try number one. We're going to try to continue to mount the file systems, and we'll see how successful it is. All right. An error occurred trying to mount all or some of your file systems, but some of it may be mounted under sysroot. Now, what happened was the rescue environment accessed the slash file system. It looked at the etc fstab file and then tried to reassemble my directory structure based off the devices listed in the etc fstab file. So if I use mount, what I see in this is down at the very bottom, dev mapper rel root on mount sysroot. So I was able to access out of that fstab file. Actually, I'm going to show it to you. Mount sysroot, the fstab. So I was able to read this file, and then from this file, it was able to successfully access the dev mapper rel root device and mount it. But it wasn't able to access anything else out of this directory, specifically that UUID file system with /boot. When it tried to access that one, it couldn't find the UUID because I destroyed it with my DD command earlier. All right, so we are now in a RAM disk environment. If I look at mount sysroot, those are my files and directories. All right, so that's what's stored on the disk of my machine. All right, so I have a couple of choices here. One is I can try to recreate the boot device that I completely and utterly destroyed. That is a hard thing to do because I have to have all the right file contents. I would need to reformat the file system and then place those file contents into place. Like, it's hard. What I'm likely in the state of now is accessing this additional data that I was able to still procure and copy it off somewhere or save it in some way. Right, and I'll reinstall the machine and then restore that data back onto its newly installed machine replacement. Right, but everything that is my machine is mount sysroot. This is one of the hardest things to realize about rescue mode. Is if you do an ls/, in rescue mode, these files are ones from the RAM disk image. So when I'm looking up here at like /home, there's nothing there because this is what the rescue environment initial RAM disk image has in it. But if I look in mount sysroot, oh, that's also not happy because there's nobody there either. How about mount, look at Etsy. All right, so I see some files and directories. But if I look in mount sysroot Etsy, those are my machine's Etsy files. So if I wanted to make a change to Etsy fstab, if I look at /Etsy fstab, that's the one in the RAM disk environment. It's blank because RAM disk or the rescue mode doesn't have any disk devices that it uses, right? But if I look at mount sysroot Etsy fstab, that's my machine's fstab file. Right, so I got it. There's the actual contents for my machine. So one of the tricks with rescue mode is when you're working with it, you want to work with everything underneath of mount sysimage. Now, one of the other often used tools that we use here in rescue mode is a tool called chroot. All right, so chroot is going to create a change-rooted environment where the directory that you're passing in as an argument is our new inside of this shell root directory. And it only works if there is a bash shell or some other type of shell program underneath the change rooted location. Well, mount sysroot is my box. My box has a shell. So if I change the root environment of my shell to the files and directories inside of my system, it includes a shell. And now if I do a Etsy fstab, right, there's my system's fstab because it's operating inside of this change-rooted environment that is limited to only those files and directories in rescue mounted under the mnt sysroot directory. Right, if I exit the change-rooted environment, now I'm looking at all of rescue with my stuff mounted at a specific mount point underneath of it. Right, so if I do a cat on Etsy FS tab, this is rescues FS tab, and I would have to reference my files with Etsy, sorry, with melt sysroot. Right. So it allows you to basically like constrain yourself within a certain directory structure. And that way, things that are natively looking for something, like if I did a password and try to change it for myself here in rescue mode, it doesn't work because there's no Etsy shadow file that stores the root user's password in rescue mode. But if I change root, now when I run password, it's looking at the Etsy password or Etsy shadow file inside of my change rooted environment, which is my system's Etsy shadow. Because the password utility specifically looks for a file called /Etsy/shadow to interact with. And inside of the rescue mode, that wouldn't be a file that's provided. And the password utility is not aware enough of its environment to go to mount sysroot Etsy shadow. So building this like change rooted environment for yourself allows some utilities that have a very specific location that it looks for files or content in to work as you would expect. All right. So that's a little bit on getting into rescue mode. So why don't we change gears and transition to the latter part of the show. So stay with us as we continue to do more troubleshooting and breaking of systems and using rescue mode to try and fix it. Right. So rescue mode. So here after the transition graphic, this is where we interact with our audience, ask questions. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button so you get notified when we're doing these, as well as gauging the effectiveness of how much you like this content. All right, so I'm looking at the chat real quick, and I see um, Iron Sysadmin podcast is here. Nice to see you. Aaron is also here. Oh, and Terry Bowling. Excellent to see you all. But I don't see any questions yet. I see that Iron Sysadmin podcast mentions that all you have to do is operate in rescue mode and then turn on networking and you're good, right? Probably not. It might work, but you probably want to have a more fixed system than rescue mode plus networking. All right, so let me see. Let me go back to my box that I booted earlier that was not operating correctly. The one that I booted into rescue kernel. One second. There's too many windows today. So what happens when we don't have Eric to jockey the windows for you? Okay. Okay, so before the transition, I had taken this machine that was operating fine, and I booted it using the rescue kernel, and I said it will boot up to what you would expect it to run, right? So we have this perfectly operational machine here. I'm going to go ahead and log into it. No, you're not even seeing what I'm doing. There you go. So we're logging into this machine. You can see that the cursor's there, and it's going to launch the desktop environment and whatnots. All right. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a uname -r. How about a uname -a? So this is the kernel that was booted. And when we go out to /boot, what we see is this VM rescue file. That's the that will match what was listed in the rescue kernel details at boot time. And then the other thing that you see is this initfs or initramfs rescue. So this is the RAM disk image that was loaded with that kernel. So booting into the rescue mode for the machine or the rescue kernel already installed on the machine, essentially will just run this specific kernel with this specific RAM disk. And the place where it's helpful to you is if your machine is having kernel or RAM disk problems. It could also potentially be helpful in other places, but that's its primary goal. If you have kernel or RAM disk problems, you can boot into this known good kernel and a RAM disk. And see if I can. I don't see anything on the uname that's actually telling me that this is the one that I'm running. Um, okay. All right, I'm trying to find where we actually reference which things are on the machine. And I can get told me in that file to make config. I don't think that's what I want. But you can also see there's a grub2 make rescue that will make the entry for the rescue kernel. It's one of the things that you can do if you need to update your rescue kernel over time. All right, but you don't want to operate in the rescue kernel all the time. You actually want to be able to get updates to your kernel and run like a normal operating kernel. So running a machine from the rescue kernel is not a great plan. All right. But it's there for if you have an unbootable kernel or you have a RAM disk image that is corrupted so that it's stopping the machine from booting. You have a couple of known good files. Oh, and I see Diablo España suggested grubby info all. Thank you. Rely on the help of my friends. Oh, yeah. That's the good stuff. Thank you, Diablo España. So right there. So this is the stanza of configuration that says what to do when someone selects the rescue kernel, right? It says, here's the VM Linux file. We're going to load out the boot directory into memory for our kernel. And then a little bit further down, the initrd. This is the RAM disk image that should be loaded for this kernel as well, which is going to have a couple of extra utilities loaded into it that we don't normally see in our normal RAM disks. But that's really the only difference between this one and other kernels. All right, so why don't we break this machine and see what we can do in installer-based rescue mode. All right, so the way that you usually find yourself in installer-based rescue mode is your machine is unbootable. So how about we do something like, um, all right. So this won't render the machine unbootable, but it will render the machine unloginable. That's not going to be really good for us. Um, oh, Diablo says it won't boot. We'll see. See what happens here. But this is going to cause a situation where we probably need to go into rescue mode, into installer-based rescue mode. So we'll boot it up in our normal operating environment. We'll see what happens. What I expect to have happen is that when we try to access user data, it can't because I've taken the password file that contains all the user data and I moved it to a place that was unexpected by the system. And so let me hit escape here. So here you go. This is it. So this is the problem that we're going to enjoy. All right, now I know that I can fix this by simply taking that file that I moved and moving it back, right? Or if I had a backup of this machine, I could restore that file from the backup. But I have to get the machine to a state where I can actually interact with it because right now I can't do that. All right, so this is where the rescue install media is handy. All right, so let me go back to sharing my whole screen again. You guys are going to get to see some what we call restream inception, where you see my whole screen, including my screen that shows me, which shows me, which shows me all the way down. All right. So let me go ahead and hard power off this machine. So I'm going to go to stop and power off. All right. Then I'm going to go to settings. I'm going to attach the installer ISO to the CD-ROM. And then I'm going to go to system and make sure that it boots off the optical device. And I also need to take that optical device and move it higher up in the boot order so that it prefers that over the hard disk. All right, and now when I boot it up, troubleshooting, rescue, load that rescue environment and kernel and RAM disk and all that stuff into memory for me. And it'll ask me my couple questions like, should it reassemble the file systems listed in the target machine's etcfs tab? All right. And while we're waiting for these couple of things, I see that Shantanu asks, would you be doing rescue mode of a Lux encrypted operating system? No, not unless I knew all of the Lux encryption keys in order to access its file data. So one of the things that you need to be a little bit aware of with things like full disk encryption is you need to be able to get into that machine in something like rescue by using the Lux commands and providing upon request the passwords for unlocking your Lux file systems. All right. So here we are on rescue. I've gotten my shell, pull it to the top. If I do let me change my share so you can see the window a little bit better. All right. So that should be a little bit more legible as soon as I share it. There you go. That should be a little bit more legible. And if I look in Etsy, remember this is rescues Etsy, right? Because I said slash. I don't want to work with the files in slash Etsy here in Rescue. I want to access my system's files. And so I'm going to cd into mount sysroot Etsy. And so here are the files that are down in my system's slash Etsy directory. And this password old, that's how we broke it, right? I did a move password to password.old. So to fix it, move password.old password. So now I've taken that file and like put it back into place. We should be good. But the other thing I'm going to do is a touch out sysroot auto relabel. So if I mess around with stuff in rescue mode, um, SE Linux may not be setting the right contexts on those files I'm messing around with in rescue mode, which will cause other problems on the machine. So by doing this relabel, when we reboot the machine for the first time, it'll see this file exists and then recontext all of the files in the file system appropriately. All right, let's exit. So you'll recall from our previous problem that it like wasn't able to access Etsy password and it just like got in this vicious cycle of terribleness. So, whoops. And I also need to change to not prefer the disk. 1 second. I need to get it back to booting off of the hard drive again. And I won't bore you with the details. I'm just going to do it. All I'm doing is changing the boot order. I could also have detached the rescue image from it. That would have worked too. Okay. So here we are. It is booted, and I'm going to go ahead and let it boot the default kernel and all the normal unattended boot things. Okay, it starts the graphical booting operation. Now, remember, this is what we were stuck at last time, right? It's just kind of circle wheel of death. And so I hit the escape button um, and it turned it off. Here we're seeing the auto relabel that I had asked for actually being executed. And then it should finish booting up into normal operating mode. All right, so while we're waiting for that, let's look over um, into the chat. Oh, Shantanu says sync reboot. So you'll see sync a few times. It turns out that that automatically happens when you exit rescue mode. In fact, when you reboot the machine, it will do a sync, which is flushing any queued up disk IO that's stored in buffers and memory out to the disk. So sync or running the sync command is a very old school Unix utility because sometimes we wouldn't gracefully shut down and that would not get written out to disk. So as long as you're using a regular shutdown operation or you're exiting your rescue mode, not just like hard powering it off, you should be okay there and not have to do this sync. All right, Shamsanu asks, how come we're not doing KVM VMs for this demo? So I am using VirtualBox, and that's because I'm running this on my Mac. My RHEL 8 box is actually sitting right over there. But it's hard for me to show you the rescue terminal on a machine that's sitting over there. So that's why, is because I have two machines, and this was the more expedient way to show the graphic interaction with the systems. All right, so Now our relabel's done. All right, we can see it's actually booting everything up. All greens, that's good. Remember last time it's just like a pile of red fails, and then it would like do a little bit of green and then red fails, and a little bit of green, red fails. There we go. And what we're expecting to see is the graphical login to show up. All right, so the machine has been recovered. So I went into the rescue mode off of the installer, repositioned and adjusted the machine as needed, and was able to recover it back to a bootable state. If I was not able to recover it back from a bootable state, at least inside of that rescue environment, I had access to the machine's disk contents, and I could do things like copy it somewhere else or put it on a backup device so that I could maybe salvage some of the data on it from inside of that rescue environment. I see someone is asking about vouchers for Red Hat certifications. That's not my department. So yeah, as far as I know, I can't give away free things. Just free knowledge. You're welcome. All right. So I think that closes us out for Into the Terminal today using rescue mode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to join us next week when we talk about some other critical system administration skills. Take care, everyone.